All right, good morning and welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about New York's Section 8 housing market and why it's so crazy. We'll also be talking about affordable housing and why that is so hard to find in New York. One thing I want to bring up is I'm going to make another video. It's about Miami. And according to Marissa Fudge, which is the director and over HUD, that's the primary place in our country that seems to be having a housing market crush is Miami. Of course, we all know that LA is actually the area, but I think I'll explain a little bit further about that in another video. So today I'm going to give you some information about the New York system. But before I do, let me do a few introductions. I am the owner of Section8Consulting.com. I've been a consultant for about 21 years. I work with around 700 or more clients a year, helping them with housing and navigate the system. I also work with landlords, sometimes up to several hundred in a year. And again, it's just navigating the system. There aren't a lot of beautiful options out there. You do have housing authorities. You can call them, and there's no cost to that. If they have time, they'll speak with you. Preferentially, they don't always have time to teach you everything that you need to know. HUD's done a fantastic job. They have housing specialists there, and they too can answer the phone and answer preliminary questions and so on. However, it's not their primary goal to teach, but they can connect you to resources. And for those that don't know, 211 and 311, which are information lines in most of the states in the country, they can provide a very limited amount of information. They are not experts in an area. It's more likely they'll give you phone numbers that may or may not work, or addresses and other things that you could visit to help you with the resources and information you're looking for. Outside of that, there are consultants like myself, most of which just work with landlords. I'm one of the few, if not the only, that works with tenants or prospective tenants that are out there looking for housing. All right, let's get on to what the story is. So I thought it was a little bit captivating. I was reading a little bit from the New York Post about this particular issue, and they go on to say that it's easy to conclude from the craziness of New York City's rental market, including the long line for a tiny rent-regulated apartments all across New York and Queens, Bronx, Manhattan, Long Island, and so on, that pretty much that the affordable housing market is completely absurd in the city. To give you a little bit of background, back in the old days when Section 8 was Section 8 and was a fundamentally different system, back then we had affordable units, we had subsidies, we also had rent control, and all those things are still present. But what makes all this interesting is New York has a different methodology to all this, where you may have a individual in a very large apartment, several bedrooms, and they stay a lifetime, 20, 30, 40 years. So, not only do New York City and the state have overhauled most of their subsidized housing than any other place in the nation, but they make an inefficient use of the housing, and rent regulation is actually helping drive the scarcity and the sky-high rents per unit out there. Now, to be clear, affordable housing for the city of New York costs effectively around $400,000. In California, in the LA area, and Orange, around $1 million. So you can see where that problem is. If HUD, the government, and so on, fund these projects for these apartments, and we're talking about millions and millions of dollars, the reality is it's not that much. In LA, $1 million is one little old unit. New York is about half that. So to be sure, looking at that, right now, if you're hoping to snag almost a 400 square foot, one bedroom apartment with a third floor walk up, you're looking at $2,300 currently. And in most situations across the nation, that would be inconceivable. Consider that the median mortgage in Phoenix is just $1,500 a month. You have to ask yourself, why are you still in New York? And then also you're getting 2,500 square feet, not 400. So it's no wonder at this point New York is suffering many losses of population and people that are broadening their search out into some of the farther out counties in New York and outside the state. But, one of the conclusions you need to look at is the state has 490,000 subsidized housing units. That's 500,000 against 8 or 9 million people. That's the most in the country and per federal Department of Housing and Urban Development, with some 359,000 units. In other words, if you looked at all subsidies across the country and you look at what New York's offering, New York actually has more in their city than most of the nation. With 5% of its nation's population, New York has 10% of its directly subsidized housing units, including public housing, housing choice vouchers, and that's for those that are individual households renting private units and rental units in buildings whose construction costs have been subsidized by the federal low income tax credit, which is known as LITCH, which requires a percentage of the units to be set aside for low income and moderate households as defined by the median area income. The staggering number doesn't even include the more than 1 million rent stabilized units out there, and whose owners must keep rents lower no matter what. Both directly subsidized and rent regulated apartments provide good deals for lucky tenants, for those of you that can find them, but a wildly distorted market. When you look at it, they did a study recently through New York University, and they discovered that rent regulated units found had moved into one more than 20 years ago. For those of you that may not be familiar with New York, you have whole families that have somehow managed to kind of game the system, and they make them generational vouchers, where it seems almost that children of the parents and parents of the grandparents are passing these damn things down by virtue of loopholes, and so people remain in these properties, forever. Looking at 23% of tenants that moved in over 20 years, three times as long as the period in market rate units. In the core of Manhattan, fully 30% of rent-regulated tenants have lived in their apartments 20 years or more. Now, effectively speaking, that 20 years could be, understanding that in this market it's dangerous to move. Low turnover means that renters of the units that might not go to market in other cities, as older tenants no longer need the space and want to limit their costs, have an incentive to stay put. In other words, nobody wants to leave, because if it's rent controlled and you've got a very large apartment or an apartment with a lot more bedrooms than what's necessary, then they just stay put. So newcomers to the city include those who might have been on a waiting list in places like Long East Village, or just simply out of luck. This isn't a housing market. It's a game of apartment musical chairs when you really do consider this. Lucky winner hits what amounts to be the housing lottery, and low rent apartments without a time limit. The same is true for those who score a designated new construction affordable, for which rent regulation kicks in. A change in income doesn't affect the rents in these units. Tenants can literally hit the state lottery number and see the limit rents increase, at best from the Rent Guidelines Board, which votes yearly on increases to rent stabilized units. To say this is an ineffectual use of a scarce public resource is an understatement. Public housing is no better. HUD reports that 30% of New York's housing authority tenants are overhoused, meaning they have more bedrooms than they need, as I was discussing earlier. And even as they wait very long on waiting lists. And again, there is no incentive to move as long as one has an artificially cheap apartment. So there are some common sense solutions, I believe, out there, but NYC has not addressed those. Could offer buyouts to tenants with extra bedrooms and make way for homeless families. High-income tenants could be disqualified for rent stabilization units, or better still, the whole crazy quit the rent regulation could be swept away, making New York more like other cities where housing is not a perennial crisis. Instead, the governor currently is pushing for an additional $25 billion of subsidized housing. Incredibly, the cost of building in a tax-subsidized affordable units in New York State tops 400,000, as I mentioned, and over $1 million if you're in LA. And so that's an incredible amount of money. When you look at all this in perspective, I think one of the easier ways for people in New York to find better housing is simply to move. Okay. Now there's preferentials in this. You cannot win against the lottery. There's no way to persuade that. As a consultant, I look at many different angles when dealing with housing authorities, waiting lists, whether or not you have the appropriate number of preferences. Let's talk about that briefly for New York. Those that are homeless, those that are domestic violence victims, those that may have HIV or AIDS, those that are extreme low income. I don't mean just low income, but extreme low income. Those with children, those that are veterans, and there's a number of different factors that can levy you higher or lower on these lists, contingent on where you're applying and what those preferences are. That's something I work with clients in all 50 states with. Another thing is seeking out vouchers in other counties where the strain's not so high. New York has a pretty broad community of homeless people, and that also strains that system because you have folks that aren't able to accept vouchers without an income, and then you're also trying to subsidize that without them having that. So it creates a further demand. But the bigger issue I see in the city of New York compared to their other farther out counties outside of Bronx and Queens is the fact that a lot of people have generational vouchers where they're complicit in the fact of passing these things down to children and so on through their policies and procedures at the housing authority, which makes these vouchers effectively locked into the unit for generations. And I know in the real old days, 70s, 80s, a lot of times people had multiple apartments. They were doing a tri-state area game until HUD started connecting some of the pinpoints of that. So it's what makes it a little bit wild. So I think probably the best way to find housing in a quicker way on a New York market is not so much about the applying aspect. Yes, an application is an application. Having the right preferences and having probably somebody that understands the system well. A lot of consultants like myself out there that have been doing this a long time understand the system internally. I know that probably over 40% of my clients are from New York, and probably a good even 40 from LA, New Jersey, and I think Florida, because those are the states that seem to be most affected by it. Sometimes you have to consider moving, and moving is a big option in the nation after this pandemic. A lot of people have really struggled with the concept of moving to different counties because if they don't have anything available, and even with a high level of criteria, preferences, and even referrals in the city of New York, you may have to look at the first time of packing up the family and consider other parts of the state or country where you would have a better quality of life if you're able to do so. So it's never really a question of whether or not, at least for my clients get a voucher, it's whether or not they have to be in the same zip code, they have to be in a specific county. So there's lots of ways. Around the nation, there are vouchers in the places where you might not imagine. And so when you have a long waiting list of 50,000 people on it, and then you're 2 states over and the list is barely a 1-year wait, and that's without preferences, then the question comes down to is how stubborn are you really being? So, anyways, I've enjoyed talking with you guys this morning. I wanted this to be brief and not a long video. And I want to wish you guys a happy 4th of July. I know that's coming up. This video was made 6/29/2022. And what I'm going to close with saying is, if you're struggling with housing, you're not sure out there in the city of New York, you're tired of figuring it out on your own, you're tired of dealing with some of the people that can't give you some of the best answers, then reach out to us. We'll see whether or not you have a good case or not, and see if we can assist you in that process. All right. It's a pleasure talking with you. We'll see you again.